Alright, still in this book. I'm in part 2, story 4, Flight for Life. That's what it says. To recap, we just met Moses. We see his birth and everything up to this point. So now, let's see what happens now. Part 2, story 4, Flight for Life. As a prince of Egypt and the pride and joy of his royal mother, Moses had everything a young man could wish. Lots of money, a beautiful home, many servants, chariots, and horses. All were his. Because of his position, people made a fuss over him, flattering him, and ran to do whatever he asked them. It was enough to turn any boy's head, and it would have been surprising if he did not have a pretty high opinion of himself and of what he can do. As he thought about the suffering of his people, he planned one scheme after another to bring about their deliverance. You know what? That little sentence just got me thinking. Yeah, he could have done all kinds of stuff, and nobody would have known. Perhaps, and this is, I guess, because I read this before, and this could be because I read it a long time ago. Perhaps this would work or that, but he had one great lesson to learn: deliverance. The deliverance, when it came, would not be wrought by him, but by God. No one in court had any idea what was going on in his mind. No one doubted his loyalty to the Pharaoh. All would have been shocked had they known that he had decided to take in the part of the Hebrew slave and try to bring their bondage to an end. So, of course, nobody took any notice when one day he had left the palace, mounted his chariot, and rode out to a section of the country where the Hebrews were working. People bowed to him and smiled at him, just as they always have done when they saw this handsome young prince. Leaving the city behind, he found himself at length at length on a lonely, deserted stretch of road. Then it was then it was that he came upon a sight that sickened him. One of the Egyptian taskmasters was cruelly beating a Hebrew slave. Looking this way, and that it made okay, looking this way, and that to make sure there was no one looking, Moses leaped from his chariot, strode over to the bully, and with one blow fell him to the ground. The poor Hebrew was astonished to see a prince of a royal house strike down one of the king's taskmasters, ran as fast as he could to tell the news to his people. Meanwhile, Moses was left with the body of a man that he had killed. Not wanting the Hebrews or himself to be accused of murder, an official he decided to bury him in the sand. Returning to the palace, he felt rather pleased with himself. He had made a good start. He felt sure that when the Hebrews heard of what he had done, as they surely would, they would rejoice that they have a friend in the court who was willing to help them. He never dreamed that they would betray him. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God, by his hand, would deliver them. But they understood not. Ugh. Confident that all was going to be well, he went out again to the next day to see what he could for do for his people. This time, and it's got a big full page painting by Harry Anderson, and the caption reads, although Moses was the adopted son of the Pharaoh's daughter, he loved his own people, and because he could not stand to see them abused, he forsook the royal courts to go into exile. And it's a beautiful, beautiful painting. He's in of course, you see the statues, and he's on the steps of a temple. It might be, of all things, it might be, they probably used a reference of Memphis. Who knows? Because this is 1954. Yeah, 54. Okay, let's get back to the story. This time, he came across two Hebrews struggling with each other, with the stronger one beating the other mercilessly. Moses was surprised and disappointed. How could I help his people if they fought among themselves? Sirs, he called to them, ye are brethren. Why do ye wrong one another? King James. He hoped they would make friends and thank him for his good advice. But instead, he was tired and separated them. The man who was chiefly at fault turned on him and said, who made thee the ruler and judge over us? Wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? They already knew. Whoa. Moses was shocked. So his action from yesterday was known. And he had buried the body, but not the deed. If this, unfortunately, Hebrew knew of it, then all of Egypt must know too. Perhaps even the Pharaoh had heard. Anxiously, he hurried back to the palace, where he found that his worst fears were true. Everybody was talking about him and what he had done. His secret was on everybody's lips. Somehow the news had been flashed all over the country that Prince Moses killed one of the king's officers for beating a Hebrew slave. The Pharaoh learned and was very angry. Such a deed was unpardonable. It was it was to it must be punished by death. In order to have the order had already had gone out for his arrest and execution. How he escaped, we don't know. No doubt some of his friends helped him. Perhaps the princess used her power on his behalf. Somehow he managed to get away without being caught. The safest place to go, he thought, was to the land of Midian. Here nobody knew him, and he would hide until the whole sorry affair had been forgotten. Yep, that's where he wound up, in Midian. But it must have been with a very heavy heart that he started out on his journey. As he bade farewell to Egypt and saw the pyramids gradually fade out of sight behind him, he knew that life would never be the same again. Gone forever was the easy days in the palace. From now on he would know the sorrow and hardship of a homeless exile. Hardest to bear was the thought of the foolish mistake he had made. He should have never killed that Egyptian. He had acted rashly. He should have taken more time to work out his plan. He had spoiled his chance to help his people, and now he could never deliver them. Day after day he dragged his weary feet over the hot, dry of the sand of the desert. Night after night he slept in the open, his eyes wet with tears at the thought of the mess he had made. At last he came to Midian and sat down by a well. As the evening drew, he saw 7 young girls coming towards him. After the loneliness of the desert, they must have been a welcome sight. He learned that they were sisters, daughters of Jethro, an important man in these parts. Presently, as they began to draw water from the well for the sheep they had with them, and of course, it has a picture of Moses and the two Hebrews were fighting. And let's go. Presently, as they began to draw water from the well for the sheep they had brought with them, some rough shepherds arrived and tried to drive them away. This was too much for Moses, so he, being trained in courtesy at home and in court, gallantly he stood up for the girls and told the shepherds to behave themselves. Then he drew the water from the well himself and poured it into the troughs for the sheep to drink. This was a strange thing for a prince of Egypt to do, but it was the first happy moment he had in many a long day. When the sheep were watered and the 7 girls bade him goodbye and hurried home. When they arrived, their father asked them why they were back so much earlier than usual. They said it was because of an Egyptian had befriended them against the shepherds and had watered the flock. Then where is he? Said Jethro. Why did you leave him at the well? Go and bring him home to supper. So the 7 girls came tropping back to the well and apologized to Moses for having seemed so ungracious. Then they took him back home, and there he stayed for many years until he learned the lesson God wanted to teach him. Strangely enough, it took exactly as long for him to learn this lesson from the wisdom of God as it had taken him to become learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So, in other words, another 40 years. So he was 80. And this is Moses looking over Jethro's flock, because that's what it says. So it took him, he was 40 years old when he killed the dude, and then another 40, he lived in Midian with Jethro, and so that made him 80 years old. Keep that in mind. He was 80 when that voice. Okay, that was part 2, story 4, and we're going to our next story here in a bit, and see you in a bit.